Hi, so section number 2 of this, we're going to be talking about the biopsychosocial perspective. Now, the biopsychosocial perspective is a conceptual model, a way of thinking about things that understands a person's mental condition in not just through the lens of psychology, not just through the lens of biology or society, but combines all three of them. And in particular, when we're looking at mental disorders, um, the usefulness of the biopsychosocial perspective is pretty clear because some disorders have clear biological underpinnings and some don't. Some have environmental underpinnings or social underpinnings. Um, so the biological perspective is looking at the physiology, things like genetics, things like brain structure, brain chemistry. When anyone says to me, "Oh, well, mental disorders caused by simply by a chemical imbalance in the brain," they're not looking at a biopsychosocial perspective. They're just looking through the biological perspective, and it misses out on the complexity of how mental disorders function. Psychological factors includes thoughts, emotions, behaviours, the emotional distress people feel, fear and avoidance, beliefs, coping methods, the number of psychological mechanisms at play in mental disorders is just huge. And of course, it's intimately connected to the biology. There's one of the at Sydney University, for example, there's an institution called the Brain and Mind, the Brain and Mind something, and I like that distinction between the brain and the mind. The brain, biological; the mind, well, that's psychological. We can't test what's going on in the mind simply with MRIs or blood tests or by dissecting a brain. It's we test psychological phenomenon through the psychological paradigm with a whole bunch of the psychological tests and experiments that you will be learning about. Finally, the social perspective. Is this talking about environmental factors and cultural factors such as work issues, family circumstances, and so on. And I found this that I think is good. This is from someone who's been suffering from significant mental illness for a long time, a psychotic disorder, so schizophrenia. And she writes, "My long-term health conditions are biological in origin, but the impacts have been felt physically, psychologically, and socially. My long-term health conditions can't be treated just through the biological model alone." She continues, "The medical support keeps me alive, but it is the psychological and social support that enables me to live." I think this is interesting, and as we'll talk about later when we're talking about schizophrenia, schizophrenia needs medication. It needs it. It's out of many of the psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia is among the most biological in origin, and it's got the most biological sort of treatments. However, the psychological and social supports are key to improving the condition of this disease and improving the quality of life in particular. And just because a disorder is biological in nature does not mean that the treatments can't be psychological or social, and that's really important. And I think a really obvious example of this at the moment with coronavirus is coronavirus is a physical disorder, but it's 100% biologically caused, right? But at the moment, we don't have a biological treatment for it. What we've got is a reaction called social distancing. So that is looking through the biopsychosocial perspective at coronavirus. We're using a social and environmental remedy to fix this. because there is no biological treatment at the moment, such as a biological mechanism to prevent it, such as a vaccine. I suppose that's in the medical illness sphere where it's so obvious at the moment, where biopsychosocial perspective and environmental changes is key, and it's even more so in mental conditions. I want to talk about reductionism a little bit. Among the academic hierarchy or the academic community, there are different levels of purity. Down the bottom of the purity scale, we've got sociologists. And psychologists tend to look down on sociologists and say, oh, sociology, that's a soft science. Sociology is just applied psychology. And then biologists look at us psychologists and say, well, that's a soft science, not even a science really. It's just applied biology. If you can understand everything about biology, how the brain works, how neurons work, what a synapse is, hormones. If you can understand all that, then you can understand everything about psychology. And psychology is just a less sophisticated version of biology. And then the chemists say to the biologists, oh, well, biology is just applied chemistry. Because if you truly understand the chemistry of the brain, then you understand everything a biologist understands. And then a physicist says, well, actually everything comes down to just simply physics and, the mechanisms that underpin chemistry are just physics. And then all over the other side, the mathematicians, who don't, some mathematicians are not, it's not an applied field at all. It's simply theoretical mathematics. They think, well, you guys, you're all just soft. You're just not pure at all. And mathematicians are the most pure field. And I think this is interesting because while this cartoon represents one view of things and how we tend to want to get to the absolute core of the problem, it's quite obvious that, if you talk to a mathematician or a physicist or a chemist or a biologist, they're not going to understand the experience of someone who's experiencing a great deal of psychological distress. And if you say to someone who's, seriously anxious, if you say to them, oh, well, look, all you need to do in order to fix your problem is get a PhD in physics, chemistry, and biology, and then you'll understand all of the brain mechanisms, and that will help you cope. Well, that would be, completely invalidating and a bit ridiculous. And so, psychology as a field, we understand a little bit about biology and chemistry, probably nothing about physics. But psychology as a discipline is really, right, how does this apply to humans? How can we take all of this knowledge that we've got from all of these disciplines and actually apply it to someone and make it useful? So while mathematics might be the most pure discipline, it's certainly perhaps not the most helpful when it comes to tackling many problems in life. Another way of thinking about the biopsychosocial perspective is through the lens of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You will have hopefully learned about Maslow's hierarchy. Maslow essentially, he was a psychologist half a century ago, and he essentially said that if someone is not flourishing, and if there's mental dysfunction, we shouldn't think, okay, there's something wrong with the human being. We shouldn't think there's something wrong with their brain chemistry. Let's dissect their brain. I'll put them in an MRI scan. He said that person simply is not getting what they need in order to survive. And so down the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy is the physiological needs. So food, drink, oxygen, temperature regulation, elimination, which means going to the toilet, rest, which means sleep, activity, which means exercise, and sex. Sex is a bit of a controversial one in that we don't need that for us to survive personally. All the other ones down there, if you don't get enough of it, you personally die. Sex, I suppose, the species dies. But the physiological needs, I suppose, from the bio perspective in the biopsychosocial model, are absolutely fundamental to us living as humans. If our biological needs are not met, we die. And it's interesting to think about like how hospitals are set up, for example. In that traditionally, hospitals have simply been set up to look after people's biological needs. So they're not, warm and friendly and places where, it meets the needs on the upper levels of Maslow's hierarchy. Some of the children's hospitals do a good job at this, at trying to meet the other needs as well. But generally, the main thrust of a hospital environment is simply look after physiological needs. Safety needs is the need for protection from things that are dangerous, protection from things like fear of the unknown. And so safety needs are part of the psychological and social needs. Love and belonging is social need, that need for belonging. Esteem needs is moving into the psychological. Cognitive needs, that's very much psychological. Aesthetic needs, psychological. And so in some ways, the biological needs are the really basic stuff that we need to survive. And the psychological and social needs are sort of higher order needs that we need in order to thrive. And then looking in at the professionals that deal with in this space, we've got a number of professionals that work in the mental health sphere. Psychologists are across, obviously, the psychological space. We understand intimately the underpinning psychological needs of human beings and the psychological treatment that can help in mental disorders. We also understand a bit of the biological needs, hence you doing this unit. And we understand quite a lot of the social needs and the environmental factors that contribute to well-being. Psychiatrists, who are medical practitioners, their training, their fundamental training is on the biological perspective. And so that's the medical model. And so they will be really engrossed in the biological perspective of well-being, and also in later years delve into the psychological needs that underpin things. Then there are social workers as well, who are critically important to the mental health space. Social workers are often found in hospitals, in that the management of hospitals have realised that hospitals only look after the biological needs of people, but people have other needs, and so there are whole social work departments who, if someone goes in for something like a knee operation, if the medical practitioners realise that, oh gosh, this isn't just a knee problem, they also have some other problems, the social work department will be brought in. And then there are medical practitioners, so your GPs, your surgeons, your neurologists, who generally, particularly with, say, neurologists and surgeons, they're only looking really at the biological space. I suppose GPs spread themselves across the biological and also the psychological space as well. And so I think it's interesting just to think about, as we go on to look at the mental disorders from a biological perspective in particular, it's not just a biological perspective. When we're looking at an actual human being, we're complicated, and we need to take into account the three perspectives. And so this is the end of video 2, and we'll move into video 3 shortly.